Hello, and you're listening to Eco Justice Radio. We present environmental and climate stories from a social justice frame featuring voices not necessarily heard on mainstream media. Welcome, I am Jack Ide. On today's show, preserving the Churro, sacred sheep of the Southwest. Host Carrie Kim will be interviewing Jennifer Douglas, founder and executive director of the Rio Milagro Foundation. She's also a shepherd to a flock of Churro sheep. Jennifer Douglas is a social practice artist, shepherd, and environmental activist that has devoted much of her life to protecting ecology in the West and creative ways of bridging ideologies between loss of biodiversity and human impact. In addition to her role as executive director for Rio Milagro Foundation, she runs a women-led farm, Rio Milagro Farm, dedicated to conservation in both restorative ecology and the preservation of the landrace primitive genetics of Churro sheep in the Southwest. Her main focus has been understanding the role landraces like the Churro have in carbon sequestering and soil regeneration in arid regions.
Aloha, this is Carrie Kim. Listeners, today we have the pleasure of welcoming Jennifer Douglas, founder and executive director of the Rio Milagro Foundation, as well as shepherd to a flock of precious Churro sheep. She'll be sharing her life's work in understanding the role of land races such as the Churro sheep and how their preservation is essential to restoration ecology and soil regeneration in our times. We thank the Tongva ancestors for their enduring presence, legacy, and leadership of this area as our show comes to you from the ancestral homelands of the Tongva. We ask and invite listeners to align and act with the native peoples of the places where you now live. May we act in solidarity with Indigenous peoples who are claimed by the places where we live and ensure their cultural heritage and lifeways remain for generations to come. Welcome, Jennifer. We're so grateful to have you on the show today.
Thanks, Carrie. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you for your life's work in restoration ecology. And as a shepherd, we thank you for your commitment as an environmental activist, and especially to preserving landrace genetics, biodiversity, and the environment.
Absolutely. I wouldn't do anything else.
So we'll begin with a little background. The Churro sheep is an icon of resiliency and adaptability in the Southwest. It was first introduced by Spanish conquerors, and then the churro became a sacred part of the pastoral Navajo or Diné way of life, and it was also integral to many others, such as the Tarahumara, the Pueblos, the Hispanics in the region of New Mexico and into Mexico. And the Churro sheep has come to symbolize aspects of cultural identity, nomadic lifeways, and iconic traditions for these peoples, especially those who have weaving traditions like the Navajo, the Diné, and also those of the Rio Grande. Both the Diné people and the Churro endured multiple threats and extermination campaigns and federal management policies, which were akin to the genocidal attempts to eliminate the buffalo and the Plains Indians. By 1970, only 450 original Churro sheep remained. However, due to the combined efforts of Indigenous shepherds, researchers, and instrumental people like Dr. Lyle McNeal and the Navajo Sheep Project, the Churro are still here. They are an essential part of regenerating dryland regions and arid ecosystems. They contribute to the health of biocrusts and bear cultural significance for many Indigenous peoples of the Southwest. Many are working to ensure that the primitive Churro sheep will thrive well into the future. And Jennifer Douglas is here to tell us more about this remarkable breed and why its inheritance matters for restoration ecology, cultural legacy, and future generations. It's a mouthful, but Jennifer, it's so important as it's your work. And many people may not be familiar with the Churro sheep. So if you could open with sharing how your trajectory evolved. How did you become connected to the Churro sheep and their preservation?
Well, it's kind of a funny story. Literally 25 years ago now, a lone sheep showed up on our doorstep in Silver
Oh,
City, New Mexico. And I had absolutely no association with sheep before that. We raised horses, we lived rural, and if anybody knows much about Southwest New Mexico, it is nestled in the foothills of the largest wilderness area in the lower 48. It is so wild and so biodiverse. It's right there at the archipelago of the Basin and Range, right at the edge of that. So we get all kinds of incredible animals from Mexico, Central America,
mhm.
North America, everything. So we are nestled right in there. And then just one day, this lone ram literally showed up at our
Wow.
door
Mhm.
and wouldn't leave. And come to find out that livestock agents, police, everything was trying to catch him on the highway, couldn't catch him, and he ended up at our house. And,
Wow.
and I'm a artist by trade and a social practice artist, and I was doing these big felted pieces and working with felt from a mill in Magdalena, New Mexico, and just come to find out the woman that had the mill was raising churros,
Oh,
and I was using the wool of churros and I didn't really realize it. And this
uh-huh.
lone
Oh.
ram was part churro that showed up,
Mhm.
and and he wouldn't leave. And it ended up that I called Betty, who owned the mill, and I asked her, what do I do with this sheep? I have no idea what to do. She just said, well, you can come and get a couple of my girls. And so that's how it all started. What was so interesting about this ram and so typical of the churro is that in this process of trying to find where he came from, I talked to
Right.
a ranching friend that lived 7 miles as a crow flies south of us, and he was there at her place and she couldn't catch him. Then he was found over the mountain range north of us at
Mm.
another friend's ranch.
Oh.
And so he was traveling.
Oh, wow.
His ears were chewed off from predators, because you think about
Okay.
a lone sheep in a
Right.
wilderness
Oh,
area.
for sure.
He was the beginning, him and his girls were literally the beginning of our farm.
Oh, that is amazing. But you didn't really know anything about the at the time. You didn't know about their significance or cultural significance, et cetera, their
I
history.
No, I didn't. And it ended up that my first contact, again, it was all serendipitous. My first contact to acquire two other ewes was with a traditional Navajo elder, and she had several ewes, and we went to go visit, and it just ended up that we became very, very close friends. And she just happened to be directly descended from
Oh,
the families that hid the churros during
termination campaigns.
the first extermination campaign in Canyonlands. And so
Mm,
her genetics were going directly to those sheep. And I had no
mm,
idea at the time. And so we were able to get some pretty incredible genetics into our flock very early, before I even knew what I was doing.
right.
E-
So it was only after you learned more about them that you realized how important they were to the ecosystem, to the peoples of the place, the indigenous peoples of the place, and how vital they are.
New Mexico, Arizona, the Colorado Plateau, this whole area is so unique and diverse and so
Mhm.
beautiful. And so much of the cultural identity is still so viable. And that's what I learned pretty quickly, is that in the Southwest US, we still have viable pastoralist communities. And
Mhm.
most of the pastoralist communities are with the Diné, the
Mhm.
Navajo, but
Mhm.
then they're also in some of the Hispanic communities.
Mhm.
They're
Mhm.
still very strong in Mexico, the
Right.
Tarahumara, and then going down to some of the Mayan communities in Oaxaca and Chiapas.
Mhm.
So that immediately piqued my interest. And then simultaneously, I started working with Dr. McNeal and mentoring with him for 4 to 5 years, assisting
Mhm.
him with some of his projects. But at the
Oh,
same time, spending a lot of time working with him, gathering up all of his old photos of the Navajo Sheep Project, talking to him for hours and hours about what he did, who he helped, who he talked to, and just learning. That's where I really learned so much about what makes the landrace churro.
Their history. Could you explain how Dr. McNeal even embarked on the Navajo Sheep Project? Like what was his interest in it, in helping to preserve this landrace?
It's another story, actually. And
That's all great.
I know. And that's what I kind of love about the sheep, is that it just brings together. And that's how we come together, is through story. And he's a professor at Utah State University in agriculture. And he just happened to be befriended this lovely Navajo family. And one of the elders, who was, 98, 99 years old, saw an image of a churro, and Dr. McNeal was there, and he started crying and said, "This is the old sheep. This is the original sheep." And that really piqued Dr. McNeal's interest. And he started pursuing that. And he also simultaneously had records and also knew some of the scientists at Fort Wingate, which was a big project from 1930s to the 1960s in northern New Mexico at Fort Wingate, where the government wanted to create a modern sheep for the Navajo so that it can fit into our standard of wool. And so they literally confiscated as many churros on the reservation as they could find, which was, I think, like 400 or 500, and systematically bred 13, 14 other wool breed sheep into the churro. Yeah, I kept meticulous records, right? And it ended up that the sheep that was brought back to the reservation, some of them were like 1/8, 1/16 churro. So that was a project that he investigated. He started talking to the scientists that were still alive in the 1970s. And then he was able to find and buy the sheep that were kept as churros, supposedly, in that project. So that's how the Navajo Sheep Project started.
Well, maybe you could tell something more about the key distinctions of the churro sheep, and why, maybe first by explaining what is a landrace species and defining that, because people may not know what that actually is.
Sure, I'd love to, because the landrace, the word landrace, is what's critical in something like this. So essentially what a landrace is an adapted species, plant or animal, specifically to a region or place. And this adapted species, it doesn't take 10, 20 years to become a landrace. Literally, it takes centuries. So what happens with that adapted species is that, they become so unique to a specific area. But then what also is interesting, that creates a very similarity to landraces throughout the world, is that there are markers that allow a landrace to become a landrace. And the markers really are about survivability, about if they're an animal, that they are incredible mothers, fierce mothers, and they're they have no problems birthing, they have a longevity, and that they have unique adaptations for that specific place that creates a survivability in them. And for instance, with the churro, what is so unique about the churro is that they are not necessarily like a domestic sheep in their phenotype, which is their characteristics, outward characteristics, in that they are more like a wild ungulate, which is a deer or antelope, than a domestic sheep. So a good example of that is their body structure. Their legs are 3 to 4 inches longer than a domestic sheep. They're what's called slab-sided. They're not they're not square like a normal sheep and wide. They're really narrow, and they don't hold fat on their, in their muscle as much. And their leg bone is very, it's not necessarily very fine, but it's much finer than a normal sheep, more so like a deer or antelope. And And I believe that their bone density is like a deer or antelope because they can hold up for long distances in rough terrain. So all of these characteristics makes them so able to move so much more efficiently in these more intense landscapes. But another thing that it does that is so fascinating is that it also enables them to move lightly across the landscape. So when we're thinking about a desert ecosystem, which is made mostly of biocrust and plants, that the churro versus other sheep, and especially cattle, has the ability to not disturb the biocrust, which is becoming essential in our hotter and drier climate.
Maybe you could talk a little bit more about the biocrust so people understand how much of the world is biocrust, what is its importance to the ecosystems, and climate change now.
Sure. So biocrust is essentially, it's a collection of lichens and mosses and cyanobacteria and other organisms, the microorganisms that cover the soil in arid areas. And a biocrust covers an estimated 12% of the planet's landmass, and it covers 30% of all dryland soils.
Wow.
The most amazing thing about biocrust is that it can sequester carbon as much as the plants and shrubs that surround it. When you look down at the ground, you just think that it's not living, but in actuality, it really is. But another interesting fact about biocrust that a lot of people don't really know is that it can withstand high levels of UV radiation by manufacturing a sunscreen pigment. So therefore, when it's as like for instance, here in New Mexico, we're experiencing so much drier conditions than 20 years ago. That is so crucial. These little details like this are so crucial just for the survivability of the rangelands that are around. Yeah, so it's just so interesting. And it's just new science. People really haven't really thought about biocrust yet. But yeah, but
people don't understand that. They go to a desert and they just trample on it. They don't really realize what they're doing in that action, right?
I know. I know. It's really kind of crazy that way. And what's interesting about biocrust, and this is something about trampling, is that it has a real strong it's very strong horizontally, but it has almost no resistance to being stepped on or trampled in any way. So when you get these large-hoofed animals in areas like New Mexico, Arizona and others that have a really high density of biocrust, that it breaks it up and destroys that whole living organism that is keeping everything together.
And how long does it actually take to create biocrust, like relative to, say, topsoil, or how many years of evolution is it to really make that biocrust, especially once it's destroyed?
I've heard, and I'm not a biocrust scientist, but I've heard that it takes about 12 years for it to recover after being stepped on. And you can really see it in the desert. If if a good example is if you drive a car across like a rangeland, all of a sudden you'll see the tire prints, and 2 years later they're still there just from that one time. And so that just kind of proves right there what happens.
Yeah, I think it's an education for many of us, because people see the signs that you're not supposed to walk in this area, and you realize now why, because life underneath that needs to be preserved. Listeners, we're going to have a break right now, and we'll be right back with Jennifer Douglas to talk more about landrace sheep and primitive genetics.
Hey listeners, quick break here. We hope that you're enjoying Eco Justice Radio. Stay connected by subscribing to all major podcast apps and visit our website, ecojusticeradio.org, to check out previous shows and guests, and get connected with us on social media for an extended version of this interview, as well as other benefits. We encourage you to become a member of our Patreon. Today you're listening to Preserving the Churro, Sacred Sheep of the Southwest, with host Carrie Kim and guest Jennifer Douglas, founder and executive director of the Rio Milagro Foundation and shepherd to a flock of Churro sheep.
So listeners, we're back with Jennifer Douglas of the Rio Milagro Foundation talking about Churro sheep and why primitive landrace genetics are important to our times and why these species matter for all of us. So you were going to speak about the term unimproved as it relates to genetics. We talked about the Churro were kind of considered as a scrub sheep or sort of a throwaway sheep and not so critically important, but and we know they are, and especially to the ecosystem. So if you could speak about unimproved versus, say, the primitive landrace genetics.
Sure, I'll be happy to talk about that. To start this conversation, I really want to say that these landrace species or these unimproved genetics, like the Churro sheep, they hold a global bank of intelligence we are just starting to tap into. And I think that has to do with all land races throughout the world, is that it is something that there really isn't much research or much done yet on their intelligence. So when we are talking about an unimproved sheep breed or just an unimproved species in general, what it is something that we haven't messed with very much. We have allowed them to adapt in a natural way to the environment in which they live. Yes. And so we haven't really disturbed that.
Yeah.
Now, when we talk about the primitive genetics in a churro, there are several different markers that pertain to these unimproved primitive genetics. So the unimproved genetics of a churro has to do with their wool and their wool quality, but it also has to do with their body and body type. And as I was talking before, just about their long legs, narrow slab-bodied, and their fine bone, this is very specific to being able to move super long distances through the environment. Another interesting thing is, as a shepherd, I've been shepherding my flock for now 22 years in the natural landscape. And I've been very fascinated how they move through the environment and what they eat. And how they move through the environment is really unique to a sheep or to any livestock species, in that they snatch and grab as they walk. They do not stay in one spot and just graze.
Is that because of predation, or why?
No, I think it just has to be, their unique adaptations. So as we go out with them, we're hiking. We're moving. It's like we're sometimes traveling maybe 5 miles in an hour. And what's interesting is my flock is very similar to a lot of the pastoralist flocks, the elders, because I learned from them how a flock needs to, the dynamics of a flock. And so we have older ewes with the younger ewes, instead of the typical idea of a state, stock of only having young animals. And
so, Jennifer, I wanted to ask you more about the major goals and aims of Rio Milagro Foundation.
Okay, yeah, the major goals of Rio Milagro are to, first and foremost, is to be able to preserve and protect the last remaining primitive genetics of the Churro sheep. That's our major goal. And I think a really interesting idea would be to be able to start from the beginning on this, and the reasons why that the foundation started in the first place. The reason why the foundation started in the first place is because, throughout my whole career with these sheep, I've been really interested in protecting and preserving these genetics. And I've realized just recently that there's been a real push to change the genetics and to modernize the genetics. And this is happening worldwide throughout most landrace species. But I had a call from a really close friend in New Mexico who is very much involved in just the sheep industry, the churros, He knows a lot. And he called me and said, Jennifer, I think the work that you're doing is fantastic, but I think that just the attitude that people are having right now and not wanting to preserve these, the sheep with the primitive genetics. I think we're done. It's done. And I knew how bad it was a struggle. And I realized at that moment that, wow, okay, it's going to be a really hard one to be able to keep this going.
Right.
And then I had an epiphany, and the epiphany was literally the realization that the way that we're going to be able to save these sheep is changing the paradigm of thinking about all sheep breeds as soft wool to fit into a knitting kind of clothing market, and a large meat carcass for the commercial value, to this small little landrace sheep that has this beautiful 3-fiber, not a 1 or 2 fiber, but a 3-fiber horse fleece, and a small carcass that is incredibly healthy to eat, as mitigators for climate. And this is the first time that this has ever happened with a sheep breed, is the thought process of having them being able to help us in the Southwest deserts and beyond. Yeah, with climate.
Are people using the sheep in adaptive grazing? I mean, is there that kind of use with the sheep, or do you envision that happening, that it'll be more viable to keep the sheep because people are using them for that purpose, for
Yes,
ecosystems and regeneration?
that's one of our goals for the foundation, is to be able to create an economic value again in these sheep. And the economic value right now is literally nil in the actual landrace sheep, the primitive sheep on, say, like the Navajo reservation, where in the wool buys, the churro wool is not even considered. It's a throwaway wool. They can't even sell it. And then wanting more of a bigger commercial sheep for meat. So what we're doing right now is we are it's kind of a threefold. So we're working and starting research on the way that the sheep move through the environment with the biocrust, and how it can preserve the environment versus other livestock. We're also looking at what and how they eat in the landscape. For instance, 2 years ago, when we had quite a bit of moisture, I was able to record at least 200 different plants that the churros readily ate. And they can readily eat more toxic plants and marginal toxic plants than other livestock. And then we are really interested in what it does in their gut and how it reacts in their gut. So that's another thing the foundation is going to work with.
So but a lot of research and being able to help us.
So we need that research to be able to have something to fall back on and to step from, as we're bringing these sheep, for their abilities with climate. But the other thing that is the most fascinating is its unique 3-fiber fleece, which is unique in the sheep world, as Dr. McNeal has always told me. And the reason why it's a 3-fiber sheep is because it has 2 beautiful fibers. It has a long fiber that is about 12 inches when it's full grown out, and it's the coarser fiber. It's the outer fiber, which actually creates a waterproofness that most other sheep breeds do not have. So that's one of their really interesting adaptabilities. And they have an inner fiber, which is soft and much softer. But then the third fiber, which is the one that we're really interested in right now, is what's called kemp. And that fiber is the indicator that it is a primitive sheep. So when it loses the kemp fiber, which is happening a lot in the more modern type churro, where they're breeding out that fiber, which Fort Wingate also bred out that fiber, then they lose that significance of their primitive traits. But it is the kemp fiber that we're finding that has these amazing capabilities to jumpstart microbes in soil. So that is something that I think is huge and that we're working with right now.
So can that be then used as a mulch, as a camp fiber mulch? Because I feel like a nod to James and Joyce Skeet of Spirit Farm, because I feel like Joyce was using that to hold moisture in the soil.
I'm hoping she is, yeah. But it's actually the combination of the three fibers, which includes hemp, that we are creating these blankets or mats that are essentially like a mulch, but then very different than a mulch at the same time, because wool can hold 300% of its weight in water and slowly release it over time.
Right.
It has this, especially the churro wool, because of its unique adaptations to the desert Southwest, has the capacity of really being high temperature regulation. So for instance, when these sheep are in full fleece, it protects them from the heat, the really intense heat, as well as really intense cold. So these extreme temperature changes that we're experiencing now with climate, these mats, these fleeces are protecting them from the extreme droughts. For instance, underneath these mats, it's still wet after a month, of being dry, and it's protecting the plants from these extreme temperatures. But mostly, what is so interesting is it's doing something in the soil where it's jump-starting the microbes in soil that is damaged, which a lot of rangelands are damaged now.
So how are they using it? Like you say, using it as a blanket. So they use it to cover the soil. What are they using it like? How do they do that? How do they actually?
So we're doing it with the foundation right now, and it's just starting. So we've just begun, and so we are designing machines to be able to use these mats.
That's amazing. I mean, amazing for drylands, like we say. If drylands are what, 40% of the Earth's terrain. I wanted to ask you, your life has been devoted to, or your site centers on interdependence and also understanding our place in the world this way. And you've devoted your life to preservation of biodiversity. Many of us understand we're undergoing the sixth great mass extinction as we speak. And what would you like to say to listeners about biodiversity and their own responsibility to protecting it in these Anthropocene times?
Yeah, it's a complex question, isn't it? It always is complex. I think about it every day.
I'll have to use the rest of the interview to explain your answer.
That's right. That's right. So when we look at biodiversity, we see it around us. We see it constantly around us. It is on our skin, it's in our gut, it is anything we touch. It is when we go outside, when we go into nature, it's about biodiversity. And I think that's the number one thing that people need to realize is that we are not all the same. Culturally, we're not all the same. And therefore, when we're out somewhere or walking or just doing what we need to do, we need to always consider the fact that we need to be very cognizant of how the world works around us, that we do not know everything. And I think that's what's so marvelous about the work that I do with the sheep. What is getting ready to happen, I think, and really break with landrace species around the world. At least that's what we want to do with our foundation, is really enable that, as well as everyone else that is working around us with conservation and biology and biodiversity and everything else, that we need to really understand how that is what is going to save us, is to be able to protect it. So my question and just what I want to get to everyone is how every day, if every single person in this planet would wake up and think, what can I do today? Just what can I do today? Then I think we would change overnight.
Well, and not thinking about ourselves and our own self-fulfillment, or, being in that kind of self-focus, because we live in that era of a lot of self. That's where people's attention is on the self. instead of really realizing our place in the world and just being one little species among an infinite number of species. So
yes, and I've seen over the 20 years being at over 20 years that I've been here over at this farm in this one spot, just the desecration of the environment is seeing the lack of species, seeing things disappear. But at the same time, I've also seen if we just give nature a chance,
yes,
it rebounds so quickly. And a great example is with these sheep, is to be able to use them in the way that needs to happen, and to really start considering all land races around the world very similar, that we will see a rebound.
how long would it take to actually, can you reverse engineer out those the other sheep that have been hybridized into the line? Like how long would it take to actually evolve that out to really reinstate the original genetics? I mean, maybe that's many, many years. I don't know.
No, it's not. As a matter of fact, Dr. McNeal and I had long conversations about this, and he always viewed that it took about 2 or 3 generations to take out the churro out of these sheep. But then it can also take, depending on the genetics that you have, maybe 2 or 3 generations to bring back these sheep. Like, for instance, a good example is in my flock. And I know that my flock right now is one of the only flocks that are like this, is that we all of a sudden have fleeces in our flock that are similar to the fleeces seen in the Navajo and Rio Grande weavings of the early like 1800s, late 1700s. And it's so fascinating. And wow, where did this come from? So now they're gorgeous. I mean, and they have about 30 to 40% Kemp, which is unheard of in modern churro. Like, you would immediately cull that sheep. But here's something that is just all of a sudden appeared.
Right. Wow. Yeah, I know in the weaving, just from what I read on your site and the Navajo Sheep Project, just the value of the wool for weaving, and that is what is traditional. So Jennifer, we're going to take another break right here, and we will be right back to talk more about churro sheep flock expansion.
Hey listeners, quick break here. We hope that you're enjoying Eco Justice Radio. Stay connected by subscribing to all major podcast apps and visit our website, ecojusticeradio.org, to check out previous shows and guests and get connected with us on social media for an extended version of this interview, as well as other benefits. We encourage you to become a member of our Patreon. Today you're listening to Preserving the Churro, Sacred Sheep of the Southwest, with host Carrie Kim and guest Jennifer Douglas, founder and executive director of the Rio Milagro Foundation and shepherd to a flock of churro sheep.
Listeners, we're back with Jennifer Douglas of Rio Milagro Foundation to talk more about the expansion of churro sheep and what's required of shepherds now. I know you're trying to recruit more people into doing shepherding. So if you could speak more about what that looks like and what kind of expansion is happening among people.
Sure, I'll be happy to talk about it. So it's complex, and the reason why it's complex is that there's so many different subgroups that are right now interested in the churro, and traditionally, culturally, there's the different groups. So it's important to be able to understand and combine, and have a general purpose, a universal purpose of the reasons why we're doing this. So about 3 months ago, we started a women's collaborative, Shepherds Collaborative. And what's really interesting about this Women's Shepherds Collaborative is that literally this is the first time in the US that a women's group is focusing on shepherding.
I love it.
Because it's mostly men, which, modern times it's mostly been men, but traditionally it's been matriarchal most of the time. So we're going back to the idea of women. And then we're focusing on the churro sheep and climate change. That is our main focus, which aligns with everything that we're doing with the foundation. But then most importantly, for the first time, we're focusing on an intercultural women's group. So we are starting to collect women of all ages, from the Pueblos, from Navajo, from Hispanic. We're now thinking about and interested in getting some of the Tarahumara shepherds, the Mayan shepherds in Oaxaca, Anglo shepherds that, like, for instance, like myself, all women as a coalition. Yeah, to be able
That's amazing. I love that. Yeah. I mean, we know we need more shepherds because this adaptive grazing piece and also preserving these species, we need shepherds, right?
Yes, we do. And also it's an interesting idea of being on the land and understanding the land, and then being able to understand the cultures that surround the land and the sheep.
You had said something, there was a quote about we are drowning in information, but we are starved of wisdom. And I think what you're referring to is maybe this wisdom of the wildness, like allowing the Churro sheep to be our teachers because they are adapting to their surroundings. They're observing everything and they have their instincts intact. If you could talk more about this wisdom that you speak of.
Oh yeah, and I think that is the idea of shepherding is the wisdom, is being able to learn from the sheep and learn from the situation as it changes, as we go through the environment. And so it's a wisdom that is being lost really quickly. It's a wisdom that has to do with quiet. It's a wisdom that has to do with contemplation. A good example is I hand shear most of my flock. I have a flock of about 140 churros right now. And every day I shear maybe 5 sheep in the summer just because I'm busy with the farm and busy with everything else. But again, it's this wisdom that you learn. And so it's as simple as learning the wisdom from the shears quietly going through the fleece, hearing as they go through, feeling as they go through. You're not using your sights, you're just listening and feeling the quietness of the sheep around you, because we generally just shear in the pen itself. As they gather around and they lay down and they chew their cud, even though they're not tame, they know that we're not there to hurt them. They know I'm their shepherd.
Sure.
And as we go out with them, it's that quietness that they have. 140 sheep, if you could imagine, all quietly walking, and all you hear is the legs going through the grass and their pallets hitting as they pull the plants and everything. What it does is that it attunes you to the place that we need to be. And I think that's the wisdom. So the wisdom happens not in a lot of speaking and talking and teaching. The wisdom happens in just the process and the ability to be able to be with these incredible creatures, but then at the same time of allowing nature around us and being sensitive to the plants, being sensitive to the air, being sensitive to any kind of predators that could be around. The dogs are there, so I think that is part of it.
Well, it's a way of life, as you've mentioned, that this way of life is what has been lost in modern times, that we need to actually restore in ourselves, this ability to listen and observe and learn from that silent place. And from that, I'd like to segue to, farms we know have become increasingly industrialized and mechanized, and animals began to disappear on the land in favor of large equipment, chemicals, GMOs, technology, and causing farming to be an isolating and unnatural experience versus one of community and interdependence. What would you like to say regarding this need for community building with the animals? I mean, you're doing this with the Women's Collaborative, and just how do we instill this even wish for the interconnectedness and returning to that in this era of high technology?
Yes, I'll be happy to talk about this. So, there's this incredible gulf between this high intensity, high technology and what I'm talking about. It's like a low tech, low tech, pre-industrial way.
Go pastoralism, go.
I know. And what's so interesting is that I live in a world of modern in technology, and then also in this other low tech
Mhm.
world. So I'm constantly going back and forth from
Right.
each
Mhm.
each different places. And I realize, like, for instance, the women's collective that we're doing, as well as connecting another process that we're doing with the foundation, is trying now to be able to record the stories that are left about the sheep.
Oh,
So it's
mhm.
about that cultural identity. And that
Mhm.
cultural identity, which is so interesting, it's not specifically a cultural identity on a specific Indigenous group, but it's
Right.
universal. And the
Mhm.
universal quality of that also makes anyone that is listening, as well as anyone that is not part of that cultural identity, part of it all. And so that's one of the things that we're working on with that, which again is the opposite of the commercial, agricultural, fast-paced
Mhm.
idea of agriculture.
Right.
Another interesting thing that we haven't really touched much on is the regenerative quality of
Right.
what we're doing.
Mhm.
And I think it's that real association and that real intimacy that we have with the environment, and seeing what's happening in the dry, in this big dry that we're experiencing, the big heat we're experiencing,
Right.
and seeing how plants are not surviving, and the need for us to constantly change our ideas on how regenerative agriculture works in our constantly changing landscape with climate right now.
Mhm. Mhm.
And also, which is really making me understand the need to be able to get these landrace species popular in the idea of regenerative agriculture, because right now still regenerative agriculture has to do with more of the commercial aspects of beef and sheep,
Mhm.
but really making people understand using what's left of these landrace species, and that again involves plants and animals at the same time
I'm
in
wondering
agriculture.
if you could mention, or if you know what are sort of the numbers of landrace species that are really crucial to protecting globally. Like, what kind of numbers of animals are we looking at? Do you have any idea?
I
On
don't
different
really
continents?
have any idea, but the one thing I can say is every region of the world has their landrace species,
Mhm.
and every region of the world that I know of is having a time keeping their landrace species
Right.
intact. That's something that is needs to be addressed right now.
But they
So
are
if you,
key to the future, right? And to the preservation of humanity and just life itself. Our ecosystems depend on these animals.
yes,
Yeah.
yes,
And the
exactly.
microbiology that they support and all that interrelationship, that happens. I'm wondering if you could talk about, I know it's such a dark topic, but we need to address these things as your thoughts on biotech, transgenic animals, recombinant DNA, and the accelerated rush to genetically modify all things in nature. We know the biotech industry is predicated upon this ability to add new genes to cells, plants, and animals, and everything needs to be modified. Even this term, like when you say that there's the improved, it's really who's making that word, who determines that word, that is what's improved when man has tampered with it. When humans have tampered with it, then it's improved. Is that what it's very it's a bizarre concept. But we know mice, goats, cows have all been engineered to create certain proteins in their milks. Pigs, mosquitoes, we have so much different things that are happening regarding species.
Yes, yes, I want to say this first is we don't even understand what the churro can do yet, right? For the environment. And here we are manufacturing and changing and gene splicing and all of this stuff when it's right in front of us, something that can assist us more so than what we can do. And so it's a real catch-22 for me, is I intuitively I just want to scream sometimes with all of that, because so much of the time there's problems that are associated with once we create it.
Right. We don't know what the consequences are. It's hard to know in advance.
Exactly. Yeah. So we don't really understand the consequences.
Mhm.
therefore, I think really the best way that I can talk about it is we first need to understand what's around us and the gifts that can be given to us that is around us before we start engineering anything else.
I think that's kind of the human hubris, right? To we can improve it. Let's improve it. I mean, let's change it. It's got this obsessive need to change things, and we cannot observe things as they are and learn from what is. And that is a very Zen concept. I think we all need to adopt that.
Okay, let's go to let's be a pastoralist, right?
Yeah. I mean, not to say that it doesn't happen in nature. Of course, we know that bacteria, virus, they all evolve, and there's horizontal gene transfer that happens naturally, but we have to have these concerns around ethics, around inherent risks and unknown risks, and proper motivation regarding gene editing in the first place. Can't
yes,
be
and we have to be humble about it. We have to, if we're going to do something like that, we need to let go of our ego and just do it for the good of it all, and I think in the hearts of so many of these people that are the scientists that are discovering this stuff, that they are doing that, but we need to make sure that it stays, and that gets back to what you were talking about with ethics.
I wonder if you could speak about if there's anything more to mention about how the Churro sheep benefit rangelands in terms of how they aid in sequestering carbon. We know carbon is not the only answer, but it's the soil and benefiting the soil and regenerating the soil and the microbiology in the soil.
Yes, of course. So there's three different ways that it sequesters carbon. One of them is, of course, the wool, and what we're doing with the technology with the wool for soil. We're finding the wool itself sequesters carbon for the soil. The other thing is one of the other things is biocrust, is that the sheep are able to, right now, technology is, or not technology, but our research is, the way that they graze and walk through the environment assists with biocrust survival. And so, that in itself sequesters carbon. But what's so interesting, and this is new science that is starting to happen, and something that we really want to research also, is there's something that happens in the churro's gut from eating these many different types of plants, especially plants that have high tannin, that creates less methane versus other livestock. And so that is just that research is just starting. So there's all of this stuff that we really haven't explored yet that need to be explored.
So is that happening among different groups? Like, who's funding the research? I know it's all very expensive to do.
It's very expensive, yes. So Utah State University is doing some of the research on the tannins. We're getting ready to work with Sandia Labs here in New Mexico with some of our research that we're starting to do. But it's all right now, it's all new. It's all new science. And so this is what is so exciting about this, is that I'm talking about it right now, but so much more is going to be discovered. I think
I'm sure there'll be much more potentiality that people realize, and the benefits, like we say. How have the species evolved for so many years, and what they have, just the process of their evolution is amazing.
It really is. Yeah. And the change and the things that these sheep had to go through, just with people trying to change them, for the last 150 years, it's just been pretty intense.
How they've persevered. I mean, it's just like looking at a redwood tree, or just looking at the perseverance of plants who are 1,000,000 years old. I mean, these are the things we do, like you say, need to be humble to learn from them, because we assume we know so much more, and we are very, very, very young. Relatively. I wonder if you could share what restoration ecology looks like to you. How would you define that?
Oh, restoration ecology, yes. So for me, it definitely is, is to be able to sit down and really look at what is out there right now. I don't think a lot of us do that. Is just to quietly be able to see what has changed, see how it's changed, and then be able to really clearly understand my role or whoever's role in the restorative quality of the landscape that's around us. And I think everyone kind of needs to focus on the landscape that is around us for that restorative ecology to happen. And so for us right now at our farm is a good example. We live in a place that is one of the rarest ecosystems in our area of the Gila Aldo Leopold Wilderness, in a very endangered river. And so for us to be able to have a large farm like we do, and to be able to live comfortably with the many endangered species on our farm is really important.
So you have to adapt yourselves to that situation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Keep it going. You've pondered this question long ago, and probably every day, of how to make a positive difference to affect a rapidly changing world. How would you answer that question today?
Make a positive difference for ever-changing world. Oh, that's a tough one, Carrie.
It's your own question to yourself.
I know, right?
I love putting your own word, putting I guess words back into the
right.
You actually said that.
I think what's important to me is to always be aware, always to be sensitive to what's around me, to allow myself to adapt with the changing, with the change, not to be set in my own, in an own mindset or a way, to constantly learn. It's constantly be learning.
I think also that looking forward, like the Indigenous peoples who look forward to those 7 generations, however many generations down the line, it's not just our own place right now today, but how am I preserving for the future, for these unborn, for the future generations to come after me?
Absolutely.
Enough emphasis on that. But could you share how listeners can support the preservation and continuance of the primitive, the old type Churro sheep?
Absolutely. Yeah. So a really good way of doing it is go to our website at www.riomilagro.org, and you can help us. You can help through either volunteering your time and effort or donating to our research and everything that we're doing. Another good way of doing it is just starting to really understand and learn about what landrace species, plant and animals can do for us. And then even around you, wherever you are located, is that there's animals and plants that need to have preservation. And so that could be something that can happen. And then every day is just think about what I can do to help. Yeah.
Jennifer, thank you so much for your life's work. We know how important it is. We could take for granted the many species of the world, but they do not, in this time, they don't just exist without also our support in some way to ensure their preservation into the future. So thank you for your life's work, and for everyone that you're working with, all the Indigenous peoples and the other researchers and shepherds who are supporting the existence of the Churro sheep for future generations.
Thanks, Carrie. I really appreciate you giving me the time.
Thank you so much for your time and efforts.
Thank you to our guest, Jennifer Douglas, and thank you to our listeners for joining us. This has been Preserving the Churro, Sacred Sheep of the Southwest. For an extended version of this interview, please become a member of our Patreon or visit our website at ecojusticeradio.org. Please connect with us on social media at Ecojustice Radio, SoCal350, and Wilder Utopia. If you like what you've heard and you want others to be informed, subscribe, share the episodes, and help us continue our efforts by joining our Patreon or making a tax-deductible donation to the show. Project of SoCal 350. The show can be found on KPFK, KPFT, all major podcast apps, and at ecojusticeradio.org. Executive producer, myself, Jack Ite, co-host Jessica Aldridge, co-host Carrie Kim, and engineer and original music by Blake Quake Beats. And until next time, remember, the power is yours.